Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Hub. I'm Matthew Hubbard. Today's guest is Stuart Johnson. Stuart is a friend of mine. We used to work together. The first time we met was actually in New York when we were both working at Goldman Sachs, and that's a pretty funny story in itself. But maybe another podcast episode we can dive into what Stuart was reading the first day I met him. I met him. But yeah, today's guest is Stuart Johnson, friend, colleague. He's our soccer captain and our, City League soccer. He's a good friend. So Stuart, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey everyone. Stuart Johnson. I live in Salt Lake with my fiance Catherine and our dog Maple. I've lived in Utah for 15 years. Attending the University of Utah and graduating in 2014. Hubs mentioned, sorry, I'll call him Hubs as
that's totally fine.
Real nickname. But Matt mentioned after college we worked at Goldman together. I was there for about 3 years. He moved on to FIS where he actually referred me for another role and ended up working at FIS with him for about 18 months, I think. I'm still there. Obviously, Matt has moved on to bigger and better things. But
the podcast. No.
Yes. Where I work as a business analyst for software implementation. As you mentioned, I play a lot of soccer, follow a lot of soccer, mostly overseas, not as much on the MLS. Music's big in my life. I play a few different instruments. And just so we are clear on my biases, I wanted to mention my primary sources of information these days are the Wall Street Journal, Market Watch, the Salt Lake Tribune, and the Atlantic.
Great. I have been asking some other people where they get their news,
Sure.
Other guests. So thanks for doing that. So we'll go ahead and just dive right in. As listeners will know, this is a part 3 of a four-part series where we're interviewing people across the political spectrum. And Stuart is a Biden supporter. So I guess, Stuart, to kind of start off, did you always support Biden through the nomination process? As you may know, and as listeners may know, he was kind of struggling there, in the beginning. Didn't do well in Iowa, didn't place well in New Hampshire, but then came roaring back in South Carolina and then went on to win the nomination. So maybe walk us through what your thought process was as this was unfolding.
Yeah, sure. So this cycle is pretty interesting for Democrats because it almost was like the previous Republican cycle where there's so many candidates. And I think that kind of played a part in him emerging as obviously the nominee. For me, I think I was kind of spoiled for choice. I bounced around a lot. I wasn't originally a Biden supporter. When it took me a while to sort of gravitate towards a candidate because I wanted to be informed. I wanted to think about the issues that were important to me. Thinking about electability, that's something I'll talk about a little bit later. But I originally actually settled on Jay Inslee, who's the current governor of Washington, because almost his entire platform was surrounding climate change, which I actually do believe is emerging as one of the singular most important issues of our present and future. But he didn't really gain too much traction and kind of fell off. So I moved after that. I actually did move towards Biden because I thought that in the current climate, a moderate platform would probably be the right choice, in kind of a polarized America. I thought that might be a fairly electable nominee. I struggled with Biden after a little while simply because I didn't want the next nominee of the Democratic Party to just be another old, rich, white male.
Yeah.
Because there's so much of that in the current political environment already, especially when you have other candidates like Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren, or even somebody like Pete Buttigieg, who they have more diversity of experience, more diversity of background, and I thought it might be kind of a shame just to kind of settle really for Joe being, what he is. I think if he was 20 or 30 years younger, for me, he would have been a shoo-in, but he just didn't meet the demographic of what I would hope for in our next president. So I moved on from Biden and actually moved towards Elizabeth Warren because I agreed with, for the most part, I agree with many of her policies. And this will kind of be a recurring theme in that a lot of the folks in the Democratic Party, I tend to agree with. It has to do more. My support for them has to do more with, how they're going to enact change, whether they're right for the country at this time. And for me, with Warren, I thought she has a plan for everything, in very great detail. Yep. I think she's incredibly accomplished woman. And I think it's past time that we have a woman president, to be honest. I think we're due for that. And so, I was all in for Warren, and then South Carolina happened, and the decision was sort of made for me before I could cast my vote. I don't know if South Carolina was so interesting because beforehand, it didn't really seem like anyone had a massive foothold. As you mentioned, I don't even remember who won the different states, but it seemed to kind of be bouncing around a little bit. No one was able to really get the majority of the party to coalesce around them. And then obviously Biden just outright basically tore through with South Carolina, and then it was just kind of by default. So, so he's the nominee. I think I'll speak for myself, and I think for a lot of Democrats when I say I think the problem for Democrats this cycle when choosing from the pack was reconciling their need for their platform and their wants against the question of electability. Because for me, electability probably was the most important issue, is who can we get to beat Trump? Yeah. Because I can't think of a Democratic supporter that I know who said, if it's not Pete Buttigieg, it might as well be Trump. It was always going to be, whoever the Democrat is, that's who we want. But they wanted that person to beat Trump. And I think, and this is something else I'll kind of hit on throughout the podcast, is I think there's sort of two arguments when it comes to that question of electability right now in the Democratic Party. You could argue what I believe, which is in the current state of, very polarized political parties, kind of a lot of domestic turmoil, a more moderate candidate's probably the right call for more incremental change. They probably can win over a few independents, maybe even a few ex-Trump voters. Yep. And in that way, I think that might be the right path to electability. I think on the flip side, you could argue that a more left-leaning liberal nominee would energize the base and would really turn out the vote. And in that way, it might be electable. And honestly, only time will tell. Yeah, totally. I don't know what's going to happen. I think a lot of Democrats actually was hit up by a Bernie, one of the guys in Bernie's campaign when he was live in the race, and we kind of had a little back and forth about how I was supporting. I think at that time I was supporting Biden and definitely not Bernie. And he correctly pointed out that, we nominated a moderate in 2016 and that didn't pan out. Yeah. Now, there may be I think there's a lot of other issues to do that, but he's correct. Hillary Clinton did not beat Trump, and she was certainly a more moderate candidate than Bernie Sanders. So I don't know what the answer is. For me, I think a more moderate platform makes sense. And so that's why, I'm all in on Biden now. I've never thought about, sitting out the election just because my candidate didn't win. I think, I think the Democrats should support Biden now that he's winning.
Yeah, I think, I think there was probably a lot of Democratic strategists who are like, do we go with the more, liberal left wing kind of energize the base like you were talking about, or Biden kind of seems to be, someone who could pull the party together. He's, one of our previous guests said he's kind of a bland candidate. So it's tough to really, he's just kind of a bland candidate. So it's hard to kind of really really attack him or whatnot. Cause he's, he's been in politics for 47 years. He's, he seems to be pretty moderate. He's definitely not, he's no Bernie Sanders. He doesn't, he's not espousing Medicare for all or, his climate plan. Sometimes I thought he was in support of the Green New Deal. It was on his website, but during the debate he said he isn't.
Right.
So who knows what he's at in climate change? But he's more of an incremental. Hey, change. Right. Let's have incremental change here as well. Yeah. So I guess my question is, because I guess in 2016, it kind of seemed like everyone in the Democratic establishment was like, hey, it's Hillary's time. But Bernie really
Right.
like surprised a lot of people. And there was
Yeah.
kind of some, uh, you know, hey, like the Democratic establishment robbed Bernie of this nomination.
Hmm.
And, and it's interesting, like he's coming back around this time, him and Biden both, it was just them two who are left. I guess, where do you think the future of the Democratic Party is going? Is it going more toward Bernie's platforms, or is it going to kind of stay more moderate, like which I would say Biden represents? Like, if I
Sure.
was a big Bernie bro, I might not be like too fired up about this election because
Oh, sure.
this one
Yep.
doesn't really matter. Like, give me 4 more years and like then we'll really be able to nominate like the person who we really want to.
Right.
And like, yeah, like Trump's gonna be gone in 4 years, or he'll be gone, next year. Like, it
Right.
doesn't really matter. We're pinning our hopes on 2024.
Yeah,
But
that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that in terms of basically just skipping this election, in terms of the Democratic platform. I've always, for me, that's
well, and let me, sorry, and here's why I'm saying that is because wasn't that the big concern for Biden once Biden got nominated? Like he did a lot of outreach to Bernie supporters because there's a
sure.
ton
Yep.
of enthusiasm for Bernie, right? I mean,
Yes.
there's
Yep.
no Biden bros. There's only Bernie bros.
That's right.
And last election, Bernie, his supporters, a lot of them didn't vote, or they
Yep.
they voted for Trump, and
Right.
so Biden did a lot of outreach to Bernie. So I guess my question is that the future of the Democratic Party, and this is just kind of a stopgate? This is just a
Hmm.
step in that ultimate direction, or do you think the Democratic Party will shift elsewhere?
I mean, I guess the easy answer is we'll see after this election.
Fair.
I think if Joe Biden gets elected, um, I do think he gets dragged. He's a moderate candidate. I think he will have pressure from the party to move in a leftward direction.
Yeah.
How much he can do, obviously, will depend on so many things. I'm guessing it won't. Nothing extremely liberal will be enacted during his 4 years. I'm guessing.
So if Biden gets elected this time, do you think that kind of pauses a little bit the leftward tilt of the Democratic Party, or do you think it reinforces it? Because I think if he loses, I think it will split the Democratic Party. And 2024, they're like, look, we've tried twice for moderate
Sure.
candidate. We're going all in. We're electing. We're nominating someone who's, but maybe not. I don't know. This is all guesswork.
Well, that's an interesting idea, and I think we're already sort of in that the Democratic Party already sort of has that schism going on.
Yep. And to be fair, Republicans do as well with Trump
Sure,
and
absolutely.
traditional
Yep.
Republicans.
Yep, absolutely.
So,
and I think you're probably right. I think if Joe Biden loses, it probably becomes less about, I think the electable narrative of a moderate goes out the window. And I
yeah.
think it becomes more of I think the push for incremental change is also thrown out the window. I think it becomes more of let's burn the house down and start over.
Yep.
From the bottom, which we've seen with things like defund the police, with from the BLM movement. We've seen some other, far pushes left with the Green New Deal. And to be clear, just so everyone is aware, some of these ideas, like I do agree in principle with basically everything the Democratic Party is saying. Most of my issue is how do we enact this without tearing the country apart?
Yeah.
And how do we get buy-in from both sides? So I think you're right. I think if 2020 doesn't go the Democrats' way, then I think we see probably an even further push leftward and potentially a real civil war in the Democratic Party for the future. That is probably going to get dragged leftward. If Joe wins, I think it's probably slowed a little bit because I think and I made some notes on this on some of the stuff we'll talk about later, but something that I think has pushed the party left, it comes from so I think America is kind of built on incremental change. That's sort of
Totally.
designed into the system from
Right.
with how the government's set up. And we've seen incremental change do good things. And I think we've seen incremental change in the past kind of fail us, or at least fail people in the Democratic Party who are now leaning leftward, in the sense that, hey, we passed the ACA, we got expanded coverage for Medicare, all these things, but healthcare is still broken.
Yep.
Is this, how is this? We've tried to do incremental gun control in the past, and here we are, and it's not solved. And so I think that push leftward comes from people saying, we've done incremental change. Here we are, years later, we're still having problems.
Yeah.
Why don't we do something more radical? And I don't know if they're entirely wrong. I know that's probably very polarizing again. That's something I'll talk about a lot in this podcast. Is it's a lot of us versus them,
totally.
versus Democrats. And so I don't think this push leftward does anything for that. It's not going to mitigate any of that. However, maybe that does result in better change. And we've seen in times of crisis and with the right mandate and the right political push, huge change in this country in a short period of time. I don't know if this is one of those times. I guess we'll see. But to answer your original question, I think the leftward push is here to stay. How much and how far it goes will probably depend on Joe Biden's success in a month. So,
a couple of thoughts I've had while you were talking is, one, I feel like the Democratic Party is maybe like 4 years behind, or not 4 years behind, but riding the same wave that Republicans faced a couple of years ago when Trump came into the party, right? Like, I look at Trump's positions and I'm like, I don't see a lot here that, like, a traditional Republican, the GOAT party, stands for. Like, he's not really for free trade, right?
Yep.
Immigration, like, he's very much like, he said lots of like nasty stuff. He's not really in favor of immigration. World order, like, international relationships, NATO, whatever it is, like, he's not, like, in my mind, he's like, if I were to pick an 80s Democrat or a 90s Democrat and pluck him out, like, I couldn't really see the difference between the two, in terms of policies or platforms.
Right.
And I want to read like a quote, make it in America, retool and revitalize American manufacturers with a particular focus on smaller manufacturers. Like, who does this sound like? Like, this sounds like Donald Trump's platform. Remember, He was like, we need to bring back manufacturing, and everyone's like making fun of him. Right. But this is from Joe Biden's website. This is on his platform. And so for me, I'm like, policy-wise, like, Joe's kind of an old school Democrat, and Donald Trump kind of is too. Where I think Donald Trump capitalized was there was a lot of frustration with the war in Iraq. Like, we've spent billions of dollars there. Like, what did we achieve?
Right.
Immigration has been a mess for, forever, 30, 40 years. Whether you're in favor of it or against it, like, wherever you land, like, the immigration system's kind of broken.
Yep.
And, healthcare, there's kind of all these frustrations of like, hey, we've been doing, politics the same old way for the last however long, and we really haven't seen this change that you were talking about. And I think there was a lot of frustration in the Republican Party. Some of these, like, I would say the base, these blue collar Republicans, like, really frustrated with like, hey, like, the Republican elites, the donor class of the Republican Party, a lot of these policies, free trade, immigration, they get all the benefits of it, but they don't have to deal with any of like the negatives of it. Like a traditional Republican like me, right? I work in tech. Like, I'm not going to lose my job. Like, I don't have to, I live in a very safe neighborhood. I don't have like, drug issues or like things like that. And so like, for me, I'm like, yeah, more immigrants, sure. Like, things like that.
Right.
But I think the same thing's happening on the Democratic side is they see these problems that have continued to happen, rising healthcare, climate change, crony capitalism,
Yeah.
huge subsidies for the oil industry. And they're like, we've been doing the same, politics for the same 30, 40 years. We need someone new. We need to,
Yeah.
and Bernie, to me, kind of represents the Donald Trump equivalent almost a little bit.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see, like, what would happen if Biden wins, if he doesn't, if he loses. Because if he wins, to me, it kind of seems like a traditional Democratic candidate.
Yeah, I agree. I think I actually had made some notes, and I kind of came to the same conclusion that you had, where Bernie and Trump have a lot in common.
And that's the thing, is like, during that last 4 years, Trump a lot of times would be like, well, the Democratic Party stole the nomination from Bernie.
Yeah.
Too bad, Bernie. And like, I feel like there is kind of like a lot of Trump doesn't have respect for anybody, I don't think, but a lot of like, kind of like, hey, like, Bernie believes what he says, like, wholeheartedly. And like, he's not a Clinton, and so it's
absolutely. Yeah, it is. I think Bernie for me, again, recurring theme, I agree with a lot of his principles, but every time that I took issue with him, because in most of the debates and anytime I saw him, there was never a plan. It was always kind of like a bandwagoner phrase, like, oh, abolish billionaires, Medicare for all, economy doesn't, blah, 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 which I didn't necessarily disagree with. It's just like, okay, so what's next? And I felt almost kind of like Trump, a lot of demagoguery, if you will. It's like insightful language, getting people energized, which can be useful. And if you're, pushing an agenda, but I never really heard what his agenda was. Like, there was never really a clear path to enacting anything. And then you look at his history in legislation, it's not very strong.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that put me off of Bernie is we can elect him all we want. Nothing's going to happen. That was my takeaways. I didn't think he could get anything done, which is why I didn't support him in the last election. And maybe he could have gotten elected. Maybe he was the better choice than Clinton. But from my perspective, it was kind of like Trump. It was a lot of talk and no. So.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we'll close this loop up. A lot of people don't like Trump mainly because of what he says and like how he acts, his character.
Sure. Yep.
And if you look at his policies, I'm like, besides the tax cut and nominating conservative judges, which really he didn't really have much a hand in. He basically said, he's like, okay, it was like the Federalist Society, it was like, here's judges you would want to nominate. And he's like, okay. And then with the tax cut, it was, our old friend Gary Cohn, Goldman, and Mnuchin, another Goldman guy, both of them, like, they kind of pushed it through with McConnell and Paul Ryan. Like, Trump really, he didn't really, so. And then I guess one other point, when these big changes that you talk about versus like incremental, I think part of my problem is with these big sweeping changes is like, I don't know. It's like, it kind of forces the rest of America who might not believe or agree with something. It kind of forces them to live that way, which maybe is a good thing, right? Maybe like in terms of like healthcare or climate change, for example, hey, everyone needs to have, like, let's say, for example, electric car, a lot better for the environment, but it also kind of like limits a lot of choice, limits a lot of freedom. And you could argue like, well, it's for the greater good. Like, we're saving the environment. But for me, like, it's a very small step from, hey, we're saving the environment, making everyone make sacrifices, to like, hey, everyone has to like do XYZ. Everyone has to be in this war. It's a small step away from a totalitarian type of government where, government's calling the shots, or a small political elite's calling the shot, not the people, And I think that's why incremental change, like, the system is designed for that, is because, like you said, you got to kind of reach across. You got to kind of find a compromise. But the problem is like, these big issues, they stay with us. They stay.
Yeah, it's tough to find common ground when when you've got, especially like I'll just use climate change as an example. I mean, most metrics suggest that we got to figure this out in the next 10 years or we're kind of along for the ride.
Yep.
And I mean, that's unlikely to happen without very, very big change, which is, this country's just not built for. It's like you said, we're designed that way, but it's also like you said, we've got a very wide spectrum of people where we've got people on the right, people on the left, and it's hard to find that common ground, and it's likely to happen. So yeah, I don't know how that's going to work out. We'll see, but yeah, I think for better or for worse, incremental change is just kind of how America works.
Yeah, I agree. So what would be the top issues for you? You kind of talked about it, electability, and maybe climate change. Are there any others? And then, are there any others?
Sure. Well, I think that probably the most pressing is a pandemic response. This is a coronavirus response, which I have strong opinions about. I don't know if you want to save that for later.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Jump into it now. Okay. We've had a chance to see how Donald Trump responds. He had advance notice. He had scientists on his team. To say that he has fumbled it would be a massive understatement, in my opinion. I am of the view that this needed a massive federal response, the likes of which we haven't seen for some time, to get this to really just to contain it, not even to get it to go away. Obviously, we're a country of 50 states, but my girlfriend works for the public health department. I won't divulge too much, but even between municipalities, things are different. This is not the time for a patchwork response.
Yeah.
Federal guidelines.
Uniform.
States don't have a CDC.
Yeah.
We have a CDC at the national level. We have a massive federal budget at the national level. We can raise funds at a national level. So my view was always that, when we had a lockdown, and I'll talk about more about lockdowns in a second. When we had the lockdown, my view was, okay, this is when the operation starts. This is the massive, anti-coronavirus industrial complex. We're going to roll out a ton of tests. We're going to get PPE. We're going to raise funds. We're just going to throw the kitchen sink at this thing. And then we did nothing. So Trump likes to point out, I'll actually point out this one piece directly. Trump likes to point out, especially in debates and in speeches, that he closed down the country to China, which he did, albeit with very, very loose restrictions.
Yeah.
That is largely a symbolic effort. Anyone who's read pretty much anything about public health during this time will tell you that fixing this pandemic right now and containing it's actually pretty simple. You got to contact trace, you got to test the crap out of everything, and then just throw funds at it. I mean, it's not really that complex, honestly. Like, you look at successful countries, what are they doing? South Korea, everyone wears a mask.
Yep.
Testing rates are
contact tracing. Yep. And a lot
exactly.
of testing.
And so my view was this has to get done at a federal level, which hasn't happened. And I've read Joe Biden's plan. There is a federal response.
Yeah.
He's going to raise money. He's going to throw it at individuals, families, businesses. He's going to work on funding PP&E. He's not going to push the states and ask them to fight against each other for limited resources. He will demonstrate personal leadership by wearing a mask, listening to scientists, not questioning the value of some of these choices. And so in my view, even just the personal leadership thing, just him showing up to places wearing a mask, I bet our death toll would be reduced substantially. Just that. Just by him wearing a mask. Because it shows the rest of the country, this is what we need to do. Donald Trump has refused to do that time and time and again. So in my view, there is no question about who would respond better to this. And granted, it's not like Joe had 8 months and we can see what's happening, but we see the plan. We know his background. I mean, he was involved in 2009 with H1N1, 2014 in Ebola. He has a little bit of experience there. And also, I think this crisis just sort of lends itself more to a Democrat. Democrats are, more in favor of big government. Republicans aren't. And Joe Biden's going to come in and try to use the full power of the federal government to get this under control. Because despite what anyone might say about the optimism of a vaccine projection, when that's going to actually be delivered, distribution questions are still looming.
Totally.
When this is going to happen, this could very well be here to stay for not just until next year, for years, really.
Yeah.
So there's so much uncertainty, and given that climate, I absolutely back Joe Biden to do a better job on the coronavirus response than Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think Trump was looking really tough as a candidate until COVID hit. And then once COVID hit, it's been totally different ballgame.
Yeah.
And I think, like you said, it kind of stripped away all his rhetoric a little bit, and you can kind of see like how he is as a leader.
Yeah.
Now, is Biden up to the task? That's a different argument, you could say.
Sure.
But at least I do think there's value in experience, like H1N1, right? Ebola, he was there. He's kind of gone through that, crisis as well.
Yeah.
I really do think, it's been a missed opportunity for Trump with the COVID, pandemic. It really has been. I said this last week on my podcast, when the virus, when it kind of exploding in the US and things were shutting down.
Yep.
I called him a classmate who's from Hong Kong. He's lived through SARS. The culture is there that like when things, when there's a virus spreading around, everyone mask up and and then they go about their business. And he was like, yeah, wear a mask and and I was like, okay, that seems like a pretty intuitive response. Let's wear a mask. And I think my concern with like a massive federal response is like, we did pass PPE, right? And not all of the funds were used, like a big majority. And maybe the Fed was too stringent on the loans and like it wasn't rolled out properly. But that would have happened with Biden as well.
Sure. Yeah.
Giving checks to every American, that doesn't sound like that was going to have hiccups.
Oh, sure.
So a lot of those funds are still not used. They didn't go to the right people.
Yep.
Which common issue. And then my other thing. Yeah, go ahead.
I actually don't think that whole, from what I read, the economic response was actually kind of gone around in a very roundabout manner. I don't think direct checks to the American public was necessarily the right call. I think if you look at a lot of granted, the European comparison, I'll give the disclaimer for that. We know how that goes sometimes, but a lot of the rhetoric I was reading around a solid economic response would actually have been paying businesses not to fire people.
Yep.
I think that would have been much better. $1,200 is great. Not everyone needs it. What you said, $1,200 in a 6-month time period is not that much. I think to stave off the worst, it should have been, how can we minimize unemployment? Not how can we pay people who are unemployed to get by until this is over?
I totally agree. The UK did that approach. Let's pay employers to keep people on the rolls for 2 or 3 months. I think that's a much better approach because we got to check and my wife was working, I had just graduated, and it was kind of hey, this is great, but this money's coming from future taxes or inflation. We're earning more money, and it's we took the check, but it was kind of are you trying to just buy votes here? The Republican Party, it's I don't know. I do think a federal response was needed. A caveat to that though, is that New York response looks very different than in Iowa or Montana.
Sure.
And that's where a federal response kind of breaks down a little bit. Because I was reading in New York, as soon as that crisis started to happen, Governor Cuomo, he said any health decision is run through the state level. He usurped all the power and said it's only through the state level that we're going to be making decisions. And it kind of overrode the local leaders, and they couldn't call it on the ground. And what happened
Sure.
is Bill de Blasio, he wanted to do a stay-at-home order like 2 or 3 days earlier, but because Cuomo didn't sign off on it, it
Yep.
was like 3 or 4 days that like people in New York, the densest city in the US, were still walking around spreading stuff. And like that's emblematic of like a federal response is like it shuts down that information from local leaders. But, so and it information is missed, the local intel is missed. But on the flip side, like just because Montana's doing great right now doesn't mean like in 2 months they're going to be really struggling,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yep.
Like just because Florida's doing great right now and New York's struggling doesn't mean Florida can still throw, parties on the beach
Sure.
so
Yep.
that's where I think a federal response, it's tough to balance that though.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I actually I was reading a Wall Street Journal article sort of about this, and it had to do with, states' rights and states' responses. And I was reading a lot of the comment section, which if you ever want
Yeah, that's a
time,
dangerous
then
game.
go
Right?
check out the comments, even on the Wall Street Journal. But no, I do agree that there's certainly, it's kind of like the government crowding out effect.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think you could see that. I think with this much time, maybe in like the first month or two, I could see that being maybe a massive problem. Maybe we're a little too safe. Maybe our requirements are too stringent and it doesn't apply to everyone. But I think over time, as we were working through this response, it could become more piecemeal.
Yeah.
And most of my thoughts on the federal response didn't really have to do with, hey, state, do this. Hey, you do this. It was more, let's give you a ton of money and, fund your local health departments, hire contact tracers.
Yeah.
Get PPE, and maybe we tie that to certain metrics. Like, oh, if your positivity rate is above 10%, then you need to do what we say and you get this money until it's sorted out. I don't know, something like that. Where
I think
I actually on a custom basis try to help the local, the states and the local departments handle this rather than throw your hands in the air.
Yeah, I think it wasn't a high enough priority for the Trump administration. I think lockdowns were misguided, and I think they kind of like, well, we'll do lockdowns. We'll show like we have a strong response, and then they realized how costly it was.
Yeah.
And Trump realizes, whoa, the economy's tanking. This is my best chance for re-election. Opening it up, and now he's all focused on like, hey, let's just get things open. Let's get things open. Where if he would have done a more approach like, and this is where leadership matters, right? This is where character matters. And like, if he would have said, maybe we don't do lockdowns, but we'll throw a ton of money at this. We'll help, contact tracers. We'll help local, we'll coordinate supplies better, all that kind of stuff. And we'll stay on top of this. This will be the top priority. Cause like, I don't even think the COVID task response force is still existing, right?
Right.
It's like, basically we just said like, okay, like, yeah, COVID's gonna like, I think we adopted the mentality halfway through the lockdown, like we're just gonna let this thing spread, herd immunity, and like hope for a vaccine. And so like, it's kind of this disjointed response. Like we're going this way. Nope, this is pretty costly. So we're gonna like do a total 180 when, it should have been more. Yeah. Missed opportunity for sure.
Yeah, and when you put it that way, honestly, I do agree. I remember talking to some colleagues in the office, and they we have differences of opinion.
my favorite one was gun control.
And they were mentioning some things like, oh, Democrats want the economy to tank because that's all they'll have on Trump. And I was thinking, I was like, that I don't want the economy to tank so Trump will lose. I mean, I don't want Trump to win. But I don't want it at, at a great cost. And I think you're right, where I think Trump, I don't know if he could hang his hat on accomplishing that much, but the country certainly didn't appear to be in disarray and did present an opportunity. I think if he had come out swinging, if he had done these things, this could be a feather in his cap.
He really could be. And
people would be pointing to this and saying, this is why we need to reelect this man, as opposed to this is why we can't.
Exactly. Exactly. A totally blown opportunity. And, you think about it, if we hadn't instigated the lockdowns, people wouldn't have been cooped up for 3 or 4 weeks. And then when George Floyd, that tragedy happened,
Sure.
I think it would have been a much different response than, because I think a lot of people, and Trevor Noah talks a little bit about this, like they were just cooped up for couple of
Yeah.
weeks, nothing to do, no jobs. And then, this injustice happens and it's like, hey, we're taking to the streets.
It could be. Yeah.
It,
I
it
mean,
would,
that may have had an impact for
yeah.
sure.
I mean, not to mitigate like what happened there or anything, but like
Right.
it was a missed opportunity. Yeah, just a missed opportunity to show leadership. And I
Mm-hmm.
think, like I said, I think COVID really stripped away like how Donald Trump is as a leader.
Yeah.
And I just don't, yeah, I think he's sorely lacking in that
Mm-hmm.
area. So, yeah, that was a good segment because I do think Trump was looking pretty tough to beat until COVID happened.
Yeah, I agree.
So, um, I guess one thing I want to circle back to that we talked a little bit about, and I mentioned this a little bit. I think, well, I guess two things. One, I think firing up the base is the new advance in elections.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like in the 80s and 90s, it was all about making the tent bigger,
Sure. Yep.
incorporating people. But I think what's really happened is there's been a technology revolution where like you can get the exact content you want. You can listen, you can read, you can hear the exact content you want. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you have this core group of supporters, it's kind of like marketing, right? In business, right?
Yep.
Focus on your core customers. You
Yep.
don't keep trying to like do new business ideas or products where like you're like trying to make the tent bigger. It's like focus on your core customers, find your niche, find your brand. So I don't know. It is interesting, like with Biden and like what have we been talking about the last like 20, 30 minutes? Like we've talked about Bernie, we've talked a little bit about Biden, we've talked mostly about Trump. It doesn't seem like Biden's like he's more of a referendum on Trump,
Yeah.
more so than like a Bernie who's like, hey, I'm kind of planting my flag. I'm going this way.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. We'll talk a little bit later, I think, if we talk more about Biden and why specifically I'm voting for him rather than voting against Trump. I agree. It's when I was coming up with the list, it wasn't as easy as you might have thought for another candidate, and I'll freely admit that he is not he's not a candidate you get energized about. He's not a
Right.
guy that you're just waiting to hit the polls and knock on doors. And not, obviously that's not happening right now, but proverbially knock on doors and try to turn out the vote for, because he is he's not like a Bernie Sanders where he has that, or
He's
he's not
kind
like
of
an Elizabeth Warren where he's got the plan. He's just kind of like an amalgamation of the general direction of the Democratic Party and where we're at as a country.
yeah. Well, why don't you go ahead and share your list with us? Why
Yeah,
are you
sure.
voting for Trump? I mean, why are you voting for Biden and not voting against Trump? Because I think
Okay.
that's an important distinction.
Agreed. And I'll just put the disclaimer here again that rather than trying to make the case for Biden, again, using the absence of Trump, I am going to try to push out what I believe are genuine strengths that Biden brings to the table. One of them we actually just talked in great deal about is the coronavirus response. I do firmly believe that I think there's a little too much optimism surrounding a vaccine. I pray that it comes when it does and we can get it when it does. But I've read a ton of stuff, and granted, obviously, I'm just a random dude. I'm not an expert. I'm not a virologist.
Educated person, right?
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. But I've read a ton about layman's about the immunology, virology, just general pandemic-ness, I'll say. And a lot of it suggests that this would be the fastest vaccine ever developed.
Yep.
If it was developed in this time frame. Honestly, if it's developed in the next 5 years, it's still the fastest vaccine. I mean, this stuff does not move quickly.
Yeah.
Doesn't say it won't work, just it would be the fastest. The way that it's formulated, distribution is going to be extremely difficult. It requires extremely cold temperatures. The way they're packing, they're in like multi-packs, so it's not always easy to get, a dose here, a dose there. So I think the most optimistic projections that I've heard, obviously Trump, oh, we'll have it by election day, and then shortly after everyone will have it. So whether we have it by the end of the year, I mean, I've heard Q2, Q3 of next year thrown out as the options for the general populace to get it. There are one of the vaccines requires a second dose.
Yep, which is tough.
And all these complications on top of the immunology side, which is we don't know if this is going to be, is this like the flu vaccine or is this like the mumps vaccine? Do I take it and I'm done, or do I take it and I have to take it every year and then just pray that I still don't get it? Does this mutate? I don't know. There's too many questions and unresolved issues. So I think hanging our hat on the vaccine is not a wise decision. And so that's why I think, and everything I mentioned before, I think Joe Biden has a more strong response until we get to the point where vaccines are commonplace. We're back to normal life. So that'd be my first pro for Joe Biden. My second is I do, as much as we've talked about Joe Biden not having, something to moving the flag forward, as you mentioned by Bernie would, which is, he plants his flag and he's gonna die on that hill.
Right.
As much as Joe is not necessarily that candidate, I do think Joe Biden does move the country forward. When I look back at the last 4 years and I think about Donald Trump's presidency, I think about what he's accomplished. And this for me, and I am trying to strip out the biases because I'll freely admit I'm not a big fan of Trump. I don't see a lot that's been done.
Yeah.
Kind of mentioned it earlier. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Sure, it's some form of economic stimulus. A lot of economists have come out and said it has not created the quote unquote rocket fuel for the economy. It's not going to pay for itself. And who knows? And odds are, with tax cuts, sometimes you see those come back. Reversion to the mean.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I'd necessarily call that a large accomplishment. He did get it done. So, credit to him for getting something passed. He has nominated and confirmed a few judges to the Supreme Court and other courts. And I agree with kind of your assessment earlier. That was pretty much a layup. It's not something that I would necessarily call a huge accomplishment. It's, somebody passed. We have to get a new justice in. You have a majority. Boom, you're basically done. Yep. From the list and you're done. But he did get that done. Credit to him. But beyond that, I was really struggling to find something, are we in a better place on this issue? And I don't want to talk about the economy because the economy is so weird with presidents. You can give them credit. You cannot give them credit. There's a correlation, but not necessarily causation. I mean, that's the economist in me speaking, but
I totally agree. Presidents have less of an impact than you think they do.
Yes. And so I don't want to, and I will say, I will give him credit that he had managed to continue the economy moving in the right direction. I wouldn't describe it as a roaring economy personally, especially given the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But he certainly didn't blow it up. And to be clear, I don't actually pin this. It's like what we just said with the correlation and causation of presidential impact on the economy. I don't pin this recession 100% on him because this would have happened under a Biden presidency. This would have happened under a Democrat. I mean, this was always going to happen. Maybe the severity would be different. Who knows? But I certainly don't blame this 100% and put it in his court. So when you strip all that away, there's not really a lot left. When you think about Joe Biden, sure, he doesn't have necessarily a flagship issue. He is kind of the kind of the soup of the Democratic Party right now, if you will. Yeah. And I still think in 4 years' time, it'll be kind of like we'll have something like the ACA from Obama. Maybe not the ACA level, but I think on a material issue unrelated to the economy, I think we have an improvement. Now, whether that's reform, smarter gun control laws or criminal justice and police reform, or maybe continuing cleanup of healthcare, drug pricing, something like that. I think we have something that is with market incremental change moves us forward. Yeah. Maybe it's not that much. Maybe it's just one issue. Maybe it's just one piece of legislation. But I do think we can look back at the end of a Joe presidency and say, we took a step forward. We had more issues when we began this presidency than we do now. Yeah. That's something I can necessarily say about a Trump presidency right now, and especially in another 4 years. I don't know if we move forward on any of those items.
Yeah. And I think, well, do you have more that you want to keep going?
No, that's it for that point. Yep.
I think, I was reading from some of my friends that Trump, whatever changes he might make fiscally, economically or socially, like he's doing a lot of damage with like constitutional norms, like Washington norms. And like, I think Biden would kind of bring things back. Like, Biden, you wouldn't, and you saw it in the debate, like Biden's like, look, if the election, like if I don't win the election, I'll accept the outcome. Whereas Trump is like saying like, oh, the ballots are rigged. And it's like, it doesn't really seem there's widespread fraud kind of thing. And
absolutely.
And it's like, what president would be like, yeah, I don't trust the election process. We're not Venezuela. We're not.
It's very bizarre. I think it's a disservice to the democracy. And
totally.
To be frank, and that's actually kind of a good segue into just my last piece on Biden as a candidate is I think we get a restoration of normalcy to the office of the presidency.
Yeah, agreed.
And I don't think this is something I don't want this to be taken out of context. I'm not saying America's going to get back to normal and we're going to see, everything just resolve and us be perfect. This is just more of a reversion to historical expectations of what a president does and how they behave. I think he'll be a leader that children and adults alike can look up to, regardless of their political divisions. They can look at him and point to him and say, that is our president, with some degree of confidence and pride.
Not like, oh, what did Trump do over in Europe again? Or, or like,
exactly. He's not going to golf or tweet excessively or belittle opponents with silly nicknames or comment negatively on the appearance of women.
Yeah.
He'll extend an olive branch to allies and a stiff arm to despots and dictators. And I think he'll listen to experts and try to work with both sides of the aisle. And in my view, with that recurring theme, with the current state of tribalism, us versus them, polarization, Republicans versus Democrats, I think we need a little bit of that. I think we need somebody reaching across the aisle, trying to get something done with another human being, not an enemy, not an opponent, not somebody from the other party, just another person elected to office trying to get something done. And I think Joe Biden does all those things. I think we look at him and that is a presidential president. We don't have question marks just about every single day about something new or something that was said. I think and kind of a nice sub effect of this is it frees up a lot of mental energy, I think, for Americans.
Totally.
And even just for the media and just the internet in general. I think it becomes less about this person and more about the direction of the country, or even just more about our personal lives. I mean, so much of the life of a Democrat, I'll speak for myself, I assume for other Democrats, is, God, could you believe what Trump said today? Can you believe that he did this or did that? And it's exhausting. And unfortunately, it's one of those things that we have to try not to be desensitized to, especially if we have another 4 years. We can't just throw in the towel and let it be, because that's not how it should be. Yeah. But that job becomes a lot easier with Joe Biden as president.
Totally. I agree. I think there's a sense of, hey, this is how people act in the office. This is like, it's long are there days where it's like, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill would like go hang out together afterwards, and have dinner together. Like, I don't see Pelosi and Trump,
No.
going to have dinner together, shooting the breeze kind of thing.
No.
I think, I don't know if that's part of Trump's strategy, is just to suck all the media attention. The media kind of just takes the bait a lot of times. And inflames it. And, people get so riled up about like, oh, this is what he tweeted and whatnot. It's kind of like, reminds me of like a class clown a little bit. Like if you're just like, cool. Okay. Like if you focus more on the issues, I think, it'd certainly be easier with someone like Biden than with Trump. Cause he's loud, he's obnoxious, he's in your face, and he's not what you would expect a president to act like.
Yeah, I agree.
So yeah, I definitely think my one counterpoint to that, because I've thought a lot about that, is I think a lot of people forget where we were in 2016 where people wanted, just not another like politician. They wanted someone to shake up the establishment.
Sure.
They wanted someone to kind of like what we talked about. We've had politicians forever, and like,
Yeah.
where's the big change? We still have these issues, like, we still have these problems. Healthcare is still rising, climate change, whatever. And Trump to me was kind of like that. Okay, we're throwing in an outsider, and like,
Sure.
when the press and the media and politicians, oh, Trump did this. It's not how it normally is. Is like, for me, that's like, well, isn't that kind of what you wanted? You want, like, the
Yeah.
voters wanted an outsider, someone to like
Right.
shake things up. And so it's kind of like, for me, it's like, hey, voters, this is what you wanted. This is how it turned out. That's a different question, is like, do we actually think this was helpful? Do we actually think
Sure.
this solved stuff? And I don't think it did. Like,
I agree.
I think there's something to be said about experience in government, knowing how to get things done, knowing how to
Yep.
work across the aisle. And Biden, you could argue he's been a politician for 47 years. What has he done? But there is something to be said about experience and being able to get things done in a way that doesn't, divide the country, get everyone fired up.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Yep. Well, Stuart, thank you for hopping on the discussion.
Sure.
This is very informative. I try to make sure I'm up to date on, what the Democratic Party's thinking, what's kind of the big issues for them. And so this was helpful to kind of hear, someone who's a supporter of Biden. And I remember when the nomination process was going on and in Utah it was happening, my wife and I actually switched over to vote in the Democratic primary because we didn't want Bernie winning the state.
Sure. Yeah.
And I remember I texted you and I was like, hey, like, we're going to vote for someone. We voted for Bloomberg because we kind of thought,
Sure.
hey, he's a moderate, like,
Yeah.
And you were like, no. And I asked you, I was like, hey, are you a Bernie supporter? And you're like, nah, he's too far left. Like, I'm a Biden supporter. And I was, so that's why I reached out to you. I was like, yeah, Stuart's a Biden supporter here. So, all right, last question before we close.
Oh boy.
And this is just one I've been thinking about with regards to climate change.
Uh-huh.
I think, and I will say, we are going to have, I'm working with a BYU professor who's done a lot of health economics, air pollution, things like that. And I think he might come on the podcast. So,
oh, great.
Yeah, listeners, stay tuned. But I think a lot of effort could be made in terms of power generation, right? Getting rid of coal plants,
Sure.
natural gas, wind, solar. Wind has a lot of issues, right? If the wind's not blowing, it takes up a lot of land. It kills a lot of eagles. What's your thoughts on nuclear power in terms of power generation? Is that off the table for you? Because it's carbon zero.
Yeah, that's kind of like the Faustian bargain that that I think people may have to make. So that one's so interesting, right? Because
I don't want to set you up for the trap, because the trap is like, well, if you outright dismiss nuclear power and you say your goal is to decrease carbon emissions, nuclear power decreases zero. Like, what's your real goal here, kind of thing, and that's maybe like a conservative thought is like, well, why are you excluding nuclear power? We're fine, wind, solar and whatnot, but why do you take off nuclear, which really can provide a lot of energy?
Yeah.
You look at California with like wind and solar, like you get rolling blackouts, you just.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. I have a little bit more insight into this, having covered natural resources at Goldman.
See, this is why I saved it for you. I want your experience from Goldman here.
Oh boy. It's been a few years since I've really, really looked at this stuff. So you'll have to pardon me on any numbers cited or
no. Hey, this is
friends. But speaking about that, I'll start with that Faustian bargain I mentioned. It's sort of a nightmare because typically people who realize the danger of climate change I'll broadly call them environmentalists.
Yep.
Environmentalists, it's not just about, oh, let's revert climate change. There's more to it, ocean plastic,
Totally.
um, renewables, just in general, in terms of no footprint. But nuclear power has a lot of really two fundamental issues, I'd say, which is the nuclear waste. Radioactive waste is very difficult to store effectively.
Totally. Yep.
It's almost kind of like what we're seeing in Utah right now, just with housing. There's a lot of not in my backyard.
Yep.
Where no one wants to take this stuff. And Utah, incidentally, is a dumping ground for a lot of the rest of the U.S. and even in some cases the rest of the world's nuclear waste. So that's a question mark that I think will always be there. I don't, maybe in the future there's some sort of tech revolution where, or maybe just a chemistry advance where hey, this isn't an issue, or we know how to effectively store this, but that's a problem in that it creates this waste no one wants. You have to do something with it.
Agreed.
So kind of, it doesn't fit necessarily well into the environmentalist agenda, given that it creates this waste that's dangerous. The second issue is, granted, pretty rare, but it's the tail risk of nuclear meltdown. Yeah. Really, Fukushima,
Chernobyl.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we saw this. I want to say after 2011,
Fukushima.
Germany was. They had a massive amount of coal-fired plants, and we're moving almost to 100% nuclear energy. I want to say that plan just completely unraveled because of that risk, and I don't think it can be necessarily overstated. I mean, that when that happens, that's a massive impact. I mean,
it's a big deal. Yeah,
going on in some of those cases, and I guess Fukushima is the easy one just because 2011, pretty recent. I think it doesn't get a ton of attention given that it was so long ago, but it still could be causing, a lot of problems. So I think those two issues do stand in the roadblock of using nuclear power. For me, and again, this is because I haven't been as involved in this space. For me, I would almost recognize nuclear power as kind of a stopgap, maybe for like the next 20 or 30 years, because I do think the future is everyone, and this really it requires so much more to happen, improving technology in terms of solar power, or just any other renewable power, in terms of efficiency, requires a modernization of the electrical grid, storage. I mean, there's so many other pieces, but I do firmly believe the future is every unit, every building, every house is basically self-sustaining. Who knows how long that's going to take? Maybe that's kind of a utopic idea, but I think that's probably where we end up in however long that takes. So I think maybe nuclear is part of the solution until that happens. And who knows, maybe economically it just makes sense to keep it going, but nuclear is just kind of it's a tough pill to swallow for those reasons. I'm not 100% against it because I think you're right. I think if this is the only solution we have, and climate, I mean, you have to think about it in terms of climate change. If the apocalypse is incoming due to climate change, then we should probably use. But I think it comes down to just how quickly we can get in order for climate change. And I don't want to postulate too much on that because I know your question was on nuclear energy, but I mean, the costs of climate change that are projected are just astronomical and are mostly borne by those who didn't create the problem. It's mostly the underprivileged or folks in developing countries. And solving that problem may require extreme solutions, of which I think nuclear power should be considered.
Yeah, I agree. I think nuclear power has its own baggage, like you mentioned, we talked about. But I do think there are some positives of in the utopian, because our power grid is pretty vulnerable to terrorist attacks, right? And one central thing. Whereas if it's kind of like network computing, right? You have a bunch of nodes and they all feed off each other and whatnot.
Sure.
I guess my other thing with the climate change and, the Paris Agreement is I think the future is already heading that way. And I would bet money on technology, capitalism, private innovation, kind of figuring out that technology And then
Yeah.
the other thing is like, you know, the US in terms of CO2 emission has gone down. In
Hmm.
terms of overall, you know, China's pretty carbon efficient, but they're now the biggest polluters. And
Yeah.
I don't see how, you know, I don't see how they're going to sacrifice economic growth because the U.S. tells them like, "Hey, we need to worry about climate change." You know,
Yeah.
I
Yeah. I
and
think
I
that
and
that
you
is.
know other countries too. Like other countries is
Yep.
like they could view it as kind of like American imperialism, or you know,
Sure.
because it's like, wait, U.S. Now that you're rich and wealthy, you know, you're telling us what to do,
Yeah.
what we can do. It's like, you know, I don't know. That just some things I've thought about. You know, I'm not trying to find like an answer. It's just like these trade-offs that I've been thinking about. Like, yeah. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think getting it's a global problem and requires a global solution, and that is hard to get buy-in and aligning incentives. And I think you're right. I think um, private solutions, for better or for worse, are probably the way forward. I think we'll get to a point where, given the increased focus on negative health impacts of pollutants and CO2 and just general impacts of climate change, I think it comes to a point where private solutions do get funded, and
Yep.
uh,
I
that
think
becomes an increasing contributing to the solution. I just don't know. Again, my biggest fear as somebody who's always watching climate change is I don't know if these things move fast enough. And we'll
yeah.
see. Again, that's only time will tell. I mean, little personal projection I'll throw in is my guess is we move fast enough to limit climate change within a certain degree of acceptable variable or variance, and then really comes down to carbon capture and like geoengineering to really pull us out of the fire, because almost all projections suggest that we're not on track to meet any of the objectives laid out by the climate accords. You know, whether that's 2 degrees Celsius or even more, some of the even more negative projections of like 3 degrees or higher.
Yeah.
Just none of those projections were online. Were in line to meet. And so I think, you know, the sci-fi hope, I guess, is that we bail ourselves out with some just incredible technological
Technology. Yeah.
to just pull the carbon out, because I think I want to be an optimist, but everything says that we're not going to get it done.
Yeah.
I know that's a little personal aside, but
No, that's great. It's great.
yeah.
It's a good segue for, you know, listeners to like stay tuned in. Uh,
Mhm.
Professor Pope is the BYU professor that he said he would come on the show, and he has a lot of experience with air
Cool.
pollution. So I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to him, because I think that's an issue that, you know, maybe Republicans don't agree with, but I think there are some Republicans that think about it. And there's obviously it's a big platform for the Democratic Party. It's something that the U.S. is at least aware of, and it's an issue.
Sure.
And you know, I think if we can spend some time talking about it, coming up with innovative solutions,
Yeah.
it seems like a worthwhile goal. So
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to hear that podcast, because I mean, especially for us being in Utah, I mean, that's an ever-present reality.
yeah,
Inversion and living with poor, you know, with smog and living with pollutants. So yeah, I'm interested to hear what he has to say.
cool. Thanks, Stuart. Thanks everyone for listening as well. You're the man, Stu. We'll talk to you later.
Always happy to be here. Thanks, Hobbs. Appreciate it.
Yep, we'll see you.
Bye.